Welcome back to Stories in AI. Today, I speak with my dear friend Navrina Singh, the founder and CEO of Credo AI. Now, I've known Navrina for several years. She's an engineer by education, and after spending an amazing career at Qualcomm and Microsoft working in engineering and product management roles, she started and founded Credo AI in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic. Credo is backed by Andrew Ng and several other amazing investors, and they focus on helping organizations govern AI to the highest ethical standards. Navrina is also a young global leader of the World Economic Forum and also serves on the board of Mozilla Foundation. We talked about ethics in AI, trust in AI. How do you build a foundation of trust with your stakeholders, with your customers, with your shareholders? How do you really bring together stakeholders across the organization, across compliance, risk, product management, engineering, data science, to develop these trustworthy systems for your clients? We talked about governance. We talked about some best practices for organizations to follow when they embark and scale their AI journeys. I had an amazing time in this conversation, and I hope you like it too. Navrina, welcome to Stories in AI. How are you doing today?
I am great, Ganesh. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. It's such a blast, and it's such a blast to do it with you, a good friend, and I was really looking forward to this conversation. So why don't we get right into it? Start off by telling us, how did you get into AI? Tell us your personal story.
Absolutely, Ganesh. So I think I grew up in India, and growing up, I was always enthralled by solving societal problems, community problems through engineering and science, and that was my foray into engineering. Right out of grad school, got the privilege to work at Qualcomm for a long time. And my last role as the head of innovation, we were responsible for looking at new emerging businesses. And that's where we brought in machine learning to our connectivity and compute platform and focused on building a robotics development platform. And I would say this was like an eye-opening experience for me because, suddenly the powerful device that we have in our hands could now show up in factories where humans were doing pick and place of LCD screens and putting it on cell phone devices, and could do that in a fraction of seconds compared to the number of minutes a human was taking. And I would say that exposure to collaborative robots and how we were building it was my first experience and hands-on experience with AI. And this is around the time that ImageNet had just started to take fold. The great work done by Dr. Fei-Fei Li was certainly an inspiration as well. So a lot of things came together. One of my favorite stories is a company called Soul Machines, which is based out of New Zealand. I love their technology. And they were coming up with these digital avatars where they were so human-like, they could literally have a conversation, just like you and I are having, in a very interesting medium. The facial nerves of the avatars they had created were controlled by a bunch of neural networks. They could react to human emotion. They could literally have a conversation like you, just the way you and I are having it. And their first avatar was called Baby X. And this was just an experiment that they were doing, creating this baby which would sort of learn and grow with the human operator. And this was around the same time my daughter was born. So we fondly call her Baby Z, named after Baby X. And what I found fascinating was how I had this human child in our household learning and understanding the world and trying to sort of figure out, what she's going to be in the constraints, what she was seeing in her environment. Very similar to Baby X, the way Baby X was being taught through this human operator. And I would say that's where my fascination for machine learning, as well as excitement around what this technology could bring to our society, really came to being.
You've been in AI for a long time now. You have a company, you're founder CEO at Credo. AI has amazing potential, as you said, right? And it's just like from that example that you gave to everything that we see around in the world, the PwC numbers like $13 trillion in GDP value being improved by 2025 with AI. But what could go wrong? Tell us about what could go wrong with AI. I'm going right into it.
It's interesting, Ganesh. That is the core of my being right now in my life's work at Credo AI. the unintended consequences of technology is something that I started to recognize about 5 years ago. Prior to that, it was as an engineer, it's all about building cool techs and how it can improve the state of the world, how it can improve our lives. But about 5 years ago, as I transitioned from Qualcomm to Microsoft, I was really, privileged to work with some amazing teams in Microsoft, focus on conversational AI, focus on speech technology. And I saw firsthand um, the things that could go wrong, which were unintentional. So, as an example, the traditional DevOps process that we've had for building machine learning systems, it's very product centric, it's very engineering centric. But what I quickly realized was there was um, a set of stakeholders who had the right oversight coming from compliance, from policy. Their voices were not showing up in the DevOps process. And the reason their voices were really critical were because of exactly what you just said, what could go wrong. There's so much that can be going wrong. For example, as you're acquiring your data sets, are you checking the sources of that data set? Now, the reason that is really important is you want to make sure they're ethically sourced, there's no bias in that data sets, you have a very clear understanding of what populations this system that you're building could be impacting. Then, as you start thinking about the models you want to build, your choice of models become really critical. Why did you choose a particular modeling technique over the other, especially, let's say, if you're operating in a regulated environment where explanations are critical? Or when you go through validation process, have you made sure that in your validation, right explainability is built into it so that I, as like a non-tech user, can still understand how my machine learning systems are making decisions? And then more importantly, once you've packaged this machine learning application and it is providing you the right outcomes for your business, now it's in production. How is it going to impact, the multiple consumers that will be impacted by that technology? And let's ground that in a concrete example. As an example, we work a lot with financial sector right now. And in financial sector, we are looking at scenarios like risk scoring, where you might be taking in your credit card transactions to really figure out a risk score associated with Ganesh. Now, essentially, we want to make sure that the input features that go into making those decisions are not, using any of the protected class variables, or even if they are, there's an understanding of how it is getting used, so that unknowingly these systems are not creating desperate impact, wherein you could be getting a credit score much less than someone else with a different demographic profile. So as we think about what could go wrong, I mean, we've seen everything from, implications economically and educationally for humans, to safety scenarios, to adversarial attacks, to lack of reproducibility of these systems and how they're arriving at decisions. And so the plethora of challenges when this technology is unchecked is a lot. And this is where, Credo AI and what we are working on becomes really critical in how do you ensure someone coming from compliance and risk who understand how to manage risk holistically for an organization, how to manage risk for a consumer, how to disclose that risk to a consumer. Their voices come into the AI ML Ops pipeline, and there's I would say, a multi-stakeholder platform and ability to ensure that we are not just looking at it from an exciting technology, but we are looking at it as a tool that is going to be influencing the way we live, work, and play.
No, it's fascinating. You started out with the example of what you saw in the DevOps processes, right? The one fundamental thing, and it's no doubt that everybody now at least is beginning to realize how powerful this piece of technology can be, right? Everything from making our lives easier by, being able to print out and build more cell phones faster, the earlier example that you reached with robotics and human assisted AI, to like bad things happening like the Cambridge Analytica scenario and so forth, right? So there's a whole spectrum of things. But the fundamental core to this is the understanding that AI is different from traditional software development, right? You're dealing with data, you're dealing with algorithms, you're dealing with, how do you really automate human cognitive functions? So by definition, when you're automating that, those biases, those capabilities, those preconceived notions, the ethics code, everything is being packaged in. And so to successfully do that, what you're saying is, you need to include more stakeholders than traditionally who are involved in software development. So that's where AI comes in. So before we go and dive really, really deep into that, let's take a step back and talk about AI. What do you think is the state of adoption? What are you seeing in the market today? Who is adopting AI? Who is not? Who is still left behind? What's the state of the market?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to just talk from our experience and the customers and the partners we are working with. When I look holistically across whether it is finance and banking, whether it is government, whether it is high tech, whether it is HR tech, all these industries that we work across, what has become really interesting to see is that AI is moving very fast from experimentation to now being in scalable live production systems. We are working extensively with Global 2000s as well as AI native unicorns, and they have hundreds and thousands of models in production. However, having said that, I would say that there is a massive middle that we like to call as tech forward organizations that are still not sold on the balancing the risk of these AI systems with the benefits that these AI systems present, and as a result of which are very intentional and in some ways lagging to really make a decision on should we be deploying these systems at scale, or can we just use a traditional software or statistical methods to solve our current problems. So within the scope of the industry and the customers we are working in, I would say we are seeing anywhere close from 50 to 60% in the AI first category. They're deploying AI at scale. It's already bringing them a lot of business outcomes, from top line growth opportunities all the way to bottom line optimization. But we are also seeing a pretty massive middle, about 30 to 40%, which is the set of companies that are sort of still evaluating if machine learning and AI is the right answer. And do they have the right processes and structures in place to basically take that at scale within their industries.
Now, you said like organizations who are like the AI first, AI forward organizations, right? There's hundreds and thousands of models. Are they really in production, or are they just built and they're trying to get to production? I mean, can you dive a little bit more there?
Absolutely. So, obviously our sample size is going to be much smaller than if you look
Sure.
at the entire GDP. But the sample size that we are working with, I would say they are actively hundreds to thousands of models in production at scale already with the customers that we are working with.
That's amazing.
Or what we are also seeing is that even if it is hundreds of models in production, these are some of the most high impact, high revenue generating use cases that they are deploying machine learning and AI in. And as a result of which, you can imagine, it's a very traditional technology life cycle. With innovation, you want to start fast and try and see what value it can provide. And then suddenly you become intentional about it. And you're like, okay, now let me put the foundation right. And that's where
Yeah.
good governance comes in. So as you can imagine, the customers we are working with, they went fast and they have these models in production. They are realizing a lot of value, but now they're sort of stepping back, not from the production scenario, but from a perspective of, okay, this is beneficial to our business. How can we make sure that we are governing it appropriately, we have the right oversight, and we've created the right accountability structures to ensure the unintended consequences that you and I were discussing are not something that would expose the organization to additional risk.
Awesome. And balancing risk versus the reward or the benefit from these things, right? What kind of risk are we talking about for an organization? Can you detail that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ganesh, it's been fascinating when we started on the Credo AI journey with backed by some amazing investors and partners. We had this thesis that AI governance is going to become a need because of regulatory risk, that there are these upcoming policies and companies are going to figure out how to manage, the additional regulatory burdens, which could be because they are exposed to more brand risk or they are being exposed to more financial risk. And I would say we were absolutely wrong. And let me explain that to you. The companies that we are working with, which are the AI forward and the AI native companies, they are recognizing that a critical component of unlocking more sales opportunities, for unlocking more innovation within their organization, is essentially by building trust with their customers. And that trust is basically the way that they are building that trust is by providing a proof of good governance of these models to indicate that I, as an enterprise, I have taken a holistic look at what I'm building, the solutions I'm providing to my end customers, and we have provided oversight from different functions to ensure that there are no unintended consequences. And if you can provide that social proof of good governance, what ends up happening is you are inherently building that trust with the customer. And what we find is that our customers building trust with their customers is unlocking more sales opportunities. It's actually reducing procurement life cycles, where some of our customers have seen 9 months to have their technology being procured by their customers. And now that can be reduced to 3 to 4 months. And all the way to, because of that confidence that they've gained with AI in these scenarios, they're like, now we can actually bring in more machine learning and AI capabilities, which will help us scale and provide more optimization across the organization. So I would say that it's not just the risk conversation. It's about creating trusted economies and becoming that trusted brand, which I think is going to be the next revolution, similar to industrial revolution, where these companies are going to thrive and create more business opportunities.
No, there's two things that I want to get a little bit more behind the curtain on, right? One is trust, but before that, what you're also describing these organizations doing is in fact building their own self-governance policies, right? I mean, and right or wrong, because there's a lack of strict governance policy, there's no GDPR, there's no Sarbanes-Oxley for AI yet, right? I'm sure it's coming, right? But in the absence of it, it's like, look, I'm going to be a good citizen, good corporate citizen, good company. I'm going to build trust that I'm using your data the right way, making decisions the right way, and I'm doing this thing. But is that the right answer long term? Self-governance? Can brands and tech-first companies really self-govern? We kind of see how that played out with the Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, and all the other examples, right?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in bias towards action. So as you can imagine, and goes back to the same issues we've seen in the enterprises, there is a category of people who understand AI, and then there's a category of people who understand risk and who understand oversight and who understand regulation. Till they're on the same keel, it's going to be very difficult to really thoughtfully curate regulations and policies that serves all. So what's happening right now in the market is a coming together of these stakeholders to understand each other's domain, and that's going to take time. I'm also a big believer in it's not self-governance is not an answer. So to do things right, I think it's going to be multiple solutions where self-governance is just a starting point, but very quickly we are going to see soft laws and regulations, whether it is the great work European Commission is doing through their Artificial Intelligence Act, or the great thinking in the National Defense Accountability Act, NDAA, or whether it is the thinking that NIST is putting out in trying to get response around how do you do fairness testing, or whether it is FTC's business imperative around how they're going to be enforcing algorithms that unfortunately are providing desperate impact. So I think there's a lot of movement and great conversations happening, but in the absence of well-formed, well-informed as well opinions, we are going to see that these rules and standards and policies and regulations are going to take some time to come to bear. Now, should we be waiting for it, or should we start doing something that potentially could inform these policymakers? So that's where bias towards action really comes in. And I am really intrigued as well as excited about companies who take that upon themselves and say, hey, we are going to start putting in place some thinking around what this good governance could look like. And we are going to be extremely transparent about how we are doing that good governance. We are going to provide disclosures to our consumers as to how we are governing it in the absence of regulation. And then as that conversation evolves, the hope would be that that not only informs what's happening on the regulatory side, but what's happening on the regulatory side could also inform these self-regulations as well as self-governance. So I am, props and kudos to companies who are setting up initiatives, whether it is digital commitments, whether it is governance commitments, whether it's ethical AI commitments. That's a great starting point. And I think we should see more of that in the coming 18 months.
Awesome. No, I think you're spot on. That's the right way to approach it, right? And everything, if you really think about, there was no governance for regulating the internet back in the day, right? So if we had just waited, we wouldn't have had all the value creation that happened in the world, right? Obviously, probably spam would have been lower had there been some governance. But you're right on. I think kudos to all those companies and organizations really approaching it, saying take it on themselves, do what is needed, and then corral and build an ecosystem approach to going and making this happen, right? The second part of that, based on your commentary, the question I wanted to ask was trust itself, right? Is there a role? And I had Anand Rao of PwC on the show last week, and Anand was telling me, like, I don't like the word trust. And he said, like, trust happens when both parties agree on something, and then there is a transaction of intentions, right? And he used a different word. I can't recall exactly. Is there a role for the customer or the consumer of these AI-powered services in this equation? Right? Is there a role for the consumer of these services in establishing these trusts when these companies are making an effort forward?
It's a very loaded question. Do we have 3 hours to discuss that? Joking aside, I think about trust very differently. And let's go back to how you and I are building trust, Ganesh. At the end of the day, it is really around alignment of intention, followed by action, which was sort of committed in those intentions. So it's you say you're going to do something, you follow through on doing that, and you consistently do it over time. That becomes the bedrock of trust. So for us, I would say that that is super critical as brands are recognizing that in this social construct that they're operating in, it is your consumers are getting more educated about technology, your regulators are getting more educated about technology. So it's really important to set intention from the beginning as to what does good look like. And then if a brand consistently delivers on what they had set as intention, always keeping your consumers and other stakeholders and making sure your services are in service of them, that's when trust sort of builds. So what we are finding is trust absolutely is critical in this next revolution, if you will, of technology. And one of the ways that companies are starting out with is very, transparently sharing what they can and cannot do through their technology, and then being very transparent about the outcomes, and then the consumers calling them out on when the outcomes are sort of misaligned with what the intentions were set. So again, going back to how this plays into governance, we do this each and every day, and we think about it in 3 core layers. And obviously you know that really well, given you've been working with Credo AI. But we think about trust in 3 core layers. The first layer is trust with the people and processes. At the end of the day, who's building these technologies? Us, right? So is there an alignment of intention across these different stakeholders, whether you're coming from the tech groups, whether you're coming from the oversight groups? And are there processes to make sure that alignment happens in a way that there is this consolidated repository of trust, which you can reference back over and over again? The second layer of trust is the trust with these systems that have been built by us, right? And what I like to really hone down here is trust with the AI models and the AI solutions. And this is where a lot of great innovation, not only Credo AI, but many other companies are doing, is how do you do independent assessment for fairness? How do you do testing for adversarial attacks? How do you have provenance around all the decisions that were made into building that particular model? So how do you build trust with this thing which is going to become live in production environment and going to influence the way we are making financial decisions, the way we are making educational decisions, the way we are like reviewing ads on TV or on internet, etc. And then the last layer of trust is with the environment. And this is, again, a very dynamic system wherein you have to look for where are the new standards emerging, where's the new regulation, how can I pull that in so that the processes and the people and the AI models, the trust that I've built across it, still stays relevant within the guardrails of what's happening in the regulatory environment, what's happening in standard setting environment, etc. And so one of the things that I would love to, talk more about with stakeholders in these spaces is that trust in AI, and especially brought through governance and compliance, is a very dynamic thing. It's not a static thing. It's not, you do compliance one and you're once and done. Every step of this AI building system, whether it is in process or it's in production, it is super dynamic. So it's really critical for us to set intention, to clarify that intention, to follow through with that intention, to see the impact of how these AI models are actually delivering that value, and do that over and over and over again with diverse voices. And then that's something I'm super excited about as the next frontier of AI governance.
What a beautiful answer. I mean, I think you established a few things, right? One is how trust is the bedrock of this thing, and how do you actually really look at setting the intention, following through with action, and then doing it consistently.
Yeah.
And then, the models for building trust when you're building AI powered systems or automated decision systems, and think around the three layers. It's well said and well pointed out. And you touched upon something which I felt like, I know we've discussed this a few times before, right? Which is, I used to think at least a year ago that, hey, this the trustedness in a model or an AI system comes when you deploy it in production, right? But you're saying no, it needs to be every step of the way, from the time you decide to build an AI powered system to do decisions to the time you actually have it running, and then continually, as and when your environment changes, the regulatory environment or the social environment, whatever it is, you have to continuously evaluate it as a dynamic system, framework, if you will, to go make this happen. Let me ask you this. What is the role of policy then in this thing? Is it just being part of that third layer of environment, or is it broader than that?
Oh, it's so much broader than that. And I'm so glad you asked this. Within Credo, we talk about this flywheel, that AI governance as well as good AI technologies are not going to happen magically. They're going to happen when you have obviously the right products to enable sort of these diverse stakeholders to have conversations, to really understand how to build these systems with preventing the unintended consequences. And through those products, there is going to be a critical component around ecosystem building. And from day zero, you've known me for a while, ecosystem is really critical for me. How do you bring in the voice of, whether it is the standard setting bodies, whether it is the policymakers, whether it is the big fours, the third party auditors, the regulators? They're going to really inform not only the product, but how the space evolves. And then through that, there is going to be a lot of thought leadership as well as marketing, as well as education needed, because right now we all are operating at very different definitions of trust, very different definitions of ethics, very different definitions of responsible AI, trustworthy AI, and all the other lingo that you can find in the world. So I think there's going to be an evolution where at least we are going to come towards an alignment of what is this common language around what good looks like. And even if we don't come to that convergence, at least there are going to be certain themes that emerge that people can adopt from based on their enterprises, based on their use cases. And then finally, you have the critical role that policy plays. And I see that policy role in multiple ways. One is ensuring that as our world is getting built on this AI layer and our society's fabric is being driven by technology, policymakers getting more informed about what is real and what's not real in AI, what is AI, what is not AI, how to really regulate these systems, how do you put the right guardrails, who are the stakeholders to bring into the conversations to get clarity around what these new technologies, frontier technologies, can and cannot be doing. I think policy is going to play such a critical role, and we at Credo totally believe in bringing their perspective into our product, into our ecosystem strategy, into our marketing strategy. So I think it goes beyond just the regulation. It is really informing the products. It's informing the conversation. It is also bringing convergence in some way, whether it is to one point or multiple points, by really enabling the non-AI stakeholders and the tech stakeholders coming together and understanding artificial intelligence role in our world.
That's fascinating. I think there's also the aspect that, like any technology, right? Any of the revolution, the previous three revolutions, or the fourth industrial revolution, there's always going to be impact that is initially going to be a little lopsided to one part of the society, right? Be it automation displacing jobs, be it the haves and have-nots because you can, if you're a small company trying to actually do your account processing faster, you can't afford to hire data scientists, right? So there'll be a lopsiding of the value realized by different things with frontier technology. So part of the policy, as you said, is also to how do you really truly make sure that it doesn't create a dynamic within the organizations, within the society, wherein there is like a new kind of inequality created by technology, by frontier technologies, right? So there is that big, I would say, aspect that policy needs to be comprehending in policymakers need to be comprehending to make policies and so forth. So fascinating. We didn't touch upon one topic, ethics, right? And ethics is a loaded word, and you and I talked about ethical AI and ethics in AI and stuff. One of the challenges first off, how do you define ethics in AI in the context? And second of all, whose ethics?
That is, we are all on that journey of figuring out what ethics really means in the technology sense. So one of the things that we are recognizing very quickly is that your ethics, my ethics, enterprise X ethics versus enterprise Y ethics are all different. So the way we ground it in is, what do you call as your credo? And that credo that you're going to share with your consumers, and make sure that you're keeping your policies, your technologies, your people aligned to that credo, is what we are defining as ethics. So again, going back to the earlier comment I made about, is there going to be a convergence on what is ethical AI? I don't think so, because it means so many different things to everybody. But what I do see is that there is going to be this emergence on what is my ethic, what is my credo, what is my set of values that I'm going to be infusing into building my artificial intelligence, that I can, one, stand behind as they provide outcomes to the consumers, and two, be able to demonstrate value to all my stakeholders involved in that process. So I know that's a very high level definition, because right now, I think we all are trying to still figure that out, what ethical AI truly would become. But right now for us, it is, if you think about just the basic morality, as well as, how machines should be interacting with humans, that's a very well studied topic since 1970s. And at the core of it is, can we make sure that these artificial intelligence technologies do no harm to humans, and do not do any harm to human agency? So as we start to think about, how you translate that within your enterprise, how you translate that within your product, how you translate that within your business, I think there is that agency that organizations are going to sort of build it the way that serves their consumer set the best. So hopefully in the next podcast, I can come back and give you a better answer of ethical AI. But right now, I think the world is searching on what that really good looks like.
No, and to your point, I think there are fundamental human values that I think, except if you're probably part of 3 or 4 countries in the world, everybody agrees to in the world, right? And do no harm to humans, do no harm to human agency. I think it's a well-studied topic, and it's a good bedrock to actually start building off of. Right now,
Yes.
Later on, you can actually start thinking of policies like, you can't let AI sell something to somebody without asking permission, if it's a minor child, without asking permission from the parents and things like that, right? But the fundamental things are being well understood, at least, right? I think that's a good place to start. Okay.
Yep.
This is fascinating, by the way. This is a great discussion. Thank you for having some of these thoughtful answers here. What advice do you have for companies and organizations embarking on their AI journey, if they're starting their AI journey right now in this year?
It's interesting. I'm a person who believes a lot in learning by doing. So I think my first advice is really going to be around testing and experimenting, but at a very fast pace with machine learning systems, to really understand, one, do they actually serve the purpose that you're expecting it to serve within your organization? But the second is really around laying down good foundation. I think, a lot of companies who've experimented with machine learning and AI have started to deploy that in production. There's a lot of good lessons to be learned from there. And you will never build a house without good foundation. So why would you build, AI without great governance? Is a question I've been asking a lot of my enterprise leaders and partners. So I would say that as you're starting to experiment with AI, it becomes really important to also start establishing accountability structures. as well as oversight structures to ensure that one, that machine learning actually is needed within your business. If it is needed, to make sure that it is done right, and the done right can be defined in multiple ways. That's where Credo AI comes in, and happy to have those conversations. But the third thing is, now if you're going to be putting through experimentation, you've believed in that this machine learning application actually solve your purpose and you want to deploy that in production, please do not do so without good governance and oversight, and having the right accountability structures. So, for us right now, that is the core focus. And we are seeing a lot of organizations, whether you are buying machine learning because you don't have the centers of AI excellence, as you mentioned, or whether you have those centers of AI excellence and are building your own machine learning systems, really important to sort of not step back, but at least become intentional about how do you provide the structures for good governance.
Awesome. Awesome. What other questions should I be asking you?
Oh, great question. There's so much to cover there. I would say that you should be asking me about, why is it critical for organizations to start betting on governance now, even though regulation is not there?
Go ahead. I'm asking that question. Tell me the answer.
So it goes back to, again, how do you build trust with your customers? And what we are finding again and again and again is the winners that are going to show up in the next decade are going to be the brands that build that trust with their end consumers, not only to unlock more sales, but to ensure that they can retain customers longer, they can acquire new customers. And so it's really critical to start laying the foundation of good governance now and not wait for a tipping point, a GDPR like tipping point or a regulatory tipping point to say, oh, now is my moment. I better get my house in order. I think the brands that are going to be successful in this next revolution are going to be the ones who are being very intentional about oversight and accountability.
Give me a story. And I used to ask this question's caveat. My first few shows, I asked the question, give me a story of how you'll be interacting with AI 100 years from now. And people are like, are you kidding me? 100 years from now, right? It's too far out, right? Let me ask you 10 years from now. How do you think we'll be interacting with AI in 10 years from now?
With intention, and that's our goal. So I think there's going to be a language as well as a social construct constructed between the AI and humans, that there is going to be that trust layer that gets built. So am I a robot? Am I not a robot? What am I capable of? What am I not capable of? Where potentially I could be going wrong, where I can really do well. Those are the conversations that we are going to be having with AI systems. So much so that I think that's going to really help in ensuring that these technologies, which are just tools in service of humanity, become a trusted set of tools that we can depend on.
Awesome. AGI, artificial general intelligence. Do you worry about it? Does that bother you? What do you worry about?
Oh, I do not worry about Skynet. Though I would say that I love, and so does my daughter, love watching Boston Dynamic robots. And I think the progress they've made is really great. I think what I'm worried about is right now taking artificial intelligence and its benefits for granted and not focusing enough on the unintended consequences, and how these systems potentially could completely sort of disrupt the social fabric of our societies. That is something that worries me more than Skynet kind of scenarios. And as you can imagine, there's a lot to unpack there, whether it is fairness and bias of facial recognition systems, whether it is algorithms being used in educational opportunities, whether it is machine learning systems being used in war fighting. There's a plethora of use cases, and I would say that for us, really paying attention to how our biases are showing up in those systems is something to pay attention to right now.
I think, you're one thing that comes across very clear is your belief in humanity and humanity's value to doing the right thing, because you keep using the word unintended consequences, but there's also the intended consequences of a set of bad actors that you have to worry about, right? I mean, that's also another bigger problem to go solve, but which is no different with or without AI. AI just became a much more powerful tool for them to go do that. Awesome. How can the viewers and listeners get in touch with you? How can they find you on the internet?
Absolutely. I'm on Twitter at Navrina Singh. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Credo is growing really fast. So if you are excited about building the next frontier of artificial intelligence grounded in good governance, feel free to DM me on LinkedIn or on Twitter.
Awesome. Navrina, this was fascinating. Really enjoyed the conversation, and I'll let you know when we post it and stuff. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ganesh.